As an introduction to proof of afterlife by birth, I want to define exactly what I mean by birth. Birth, within the context of this discussion, is the moment when life begins. Now, what I like about this famous painting is this point right here represents the spark of life. So what you have is within the universe, there is a specific moment in time and place, location in the universe when life begins. That spark of life is what I'm referring to throughout this discussion. If we're going to solve for afterlife, we have to define the problem. So I made this illustration here to basically lay out, define what we're looking at. So what you have here is you have a timeline, and you have birth, which is the beginning, and then you have this life here, and then that ends in death here. So basically, looking at this situation now, you have this man living, standing there, like yourself or myself. We're in the middle of life. Now, when we look this way towards the past, we look back at our birth, at the beginning of life. When we look forward this way in time, we're looking at the end of life. So if you look at what we can see the output of birth here. We can see what goes into the end of life here. We know what happens over here. There's basically nothing there. And what we're trying to solve for is this here. What happens after this point here? I want to take a closer look at the left side of that initial slide where life begins. So in this diagram here, what you have is you have a timeline. So going along this timeline, then there's a specific moment right here where there's conception of life. So this point along the timeline right here is the point in time, the moment in time when life begins. So what you have looking at the beginning of life is before this moment, you have no life here. After that moment, you have life. Life exists and goes forward. So the takeaway here is conception is an event that takes place at a moment in time when life begins. This diagram shows another look at the beginning of life. So what you have in this black arrow here is you have time. And so what we've done now is we've taken time and we've sliced it with this plane being having no thickness. It slices through time. So at this moment right here, this is the moment of conception. This is the spark of life that happens at the beginning of life. And so what you have is it begins at this point right here, and then you have going forward, you have the lifeline. You're going forward through your life. You can think of it as a line that goes forward from that point. The important takeaway here is that this point right here, there is a specific location in time and space when life begins. To help identify and explain this concept of birth and what happens at birth, I came up with this idea, this analogy of a birth machine. So what I'm attempting to do here is to make something visual to help understand this concept. So what you're looking at here is my interpretation of a birth machine. So if you're looking at this now, you can see there's like an input side here and there's an output side here. So basically what we want from our birth machine, we want this to be capable of three things. One, we take nothing in from this side here. This is before birth. Passes through here and it comes out as life. And this transition from in to out takes place in an instant. So the takeaway is, before conception there was no life. After conception there is life. The transition from conception, from no life to life, took place in an instant. I've taken the birth machine and I've put it in a little different perspective. Now we're looking directly on from the side. What I'm doing is I want to take a very close look at the moment and location of when life begins. So what you're looking at here, this is time here. And our birth machine, it has an input side and it has an output side. So this right here, this white line represents the moment of conception. So basically on the left side, the red input side, we have nothing. Inside this machine, at this precise moment, this is when life begins. Life is expelled out the output side, and this transition from no life here to life after this point takes place in an instant. This illustration here is our birth machine. And what I did is I modeled this up 3D so we could get an idea of the geometry of birth, the moment life begins. So what you have here is you have a timeline running through here. So we've taken that timeline and we've sliced it with this plane here. I call this the plane of conception. So at this point right here we have height and we have width. So this is actually, we're working in 4 dimensions here. We can only display 3 of them. But the important thing to realize with this drawing right here is there's this point right here in time and space when life begins. At the beginning of this video, I presented a slide that showed, basically delineated the problem we're trying to solve for. It had a man, it had the beginning of life on the left, it had the end of life on the right, and with the man sitting in the middle. Then we went into a discussion of the birth machine, which basically takes nothing on one side, goes through, and at a specific moment in time, there's life on the other side. So now what I've done is I've returned to that initial slide, but I've added some elements to it. So if you look at this now, what we have is we have the same man here standing between birth here and death here. And what we've done is we've added the birth machine. So what we have is we put the birth machine here on the left, indicating the beginning of life. And then what we did is we added the same birth machine here on the right at the end of life. So the way you can interpret this is we have nothing here on the extreme left. We go through birth and we come out with life here. Then we live a lifespan going across here, and then we get to the end of a life. We go back into the same birth machine, and then what we have here is still unknown. So that's what we're looking at now. So what I'm going to do now is take a more specific look at the beginning and the ending of life. So now I've switched back to a 3-dimensional view, and we're going to look at the beginning of life. So in reference to the little man standing between the 2 birth machines, he's going to look to the left. He's going to look back at his birth. So that's represented by this section up here. So what we have is we have the man standing during life here, and he's looking back in time, and he's looking into this side of the birth machine. So what that looks like here is the man would be standing here, and he'd be looking back, and the important takeaway here is that when you look back to the beginning of your life at birth, what you're seeing is the output side of birth. So now what we've done is we've looked to our right, looked into the future, and we're looking at the end of life. So that's represented by this image up here. So we're standing over here somewhere, and we're looking to the future, ahead in time, and we're looking at the input side of the birth machine. So basically, from a three-dimensional view, we'd be standing here, and we'd be looking. This is what we would see. We would see the input side of the end of life, or the input side of the birth machine. So the important takeaway here is, at the end of life, we are looking at the input side of birth. So what we've done now is we've taken the information from the past few slides and we've summarized it in this slide right here. In the first slide, we took a look at the beginning of life, where we were sitting at this point here, somewhere during life, and we were looking back in time at the output side of the birth machine. Then we took a look at the end of life, where we're sitting somewhere in here, and we're looking forward in time at the input side of the birth machine. So what I want to focus on here is the geometry of this situation, because there is geometry, and geometry proves afterlife. So if you look at this from a strictly geometrical perspective, what you have is right here, you have a point in time, a specific point, one point in time where life begins. So we've placed that birth machine here. At the end of life, we have that one point in time and space when life ends, and we've placed a birth machine here. So what to realize is this birth machine here and this birth machine here are the same function. The difference is this one here, we're looking at the output side. This one here, we're looking at the input side. So basically what you're going to have is you're going to have a step up in life from here to here. Then you're going to have another step up in life from this point here to here. So we're going to look at that next. So what I've done now is I've taken the same situation that we presented in the last slide of a life between two birth machines, and I've set it back in perspective, and I've added this three-dimensional element to try to define exactly what's going on in these birth machines. Now, let's just say, for the sake of argument, that the birth machine that we have depicted here in this drawing is capable of taking life and magnifying it by a factor of 5. So the way this reads now is, on the left side of the birth machine at the beginning of life, we take a 1-inch cube, 1 inch on each side. We put it into this birth machine here. The birth machine multiplies that 1-inch cube by a factor of 5. And it comes out on the output side, it comes out as a 5-inch cube. This cube being 5 inches on a side. So this is us now. This is during life. So we go through life from the beginning of life to the end of life as this 5-inch cube. This 5-inch cube goes in to that same birth machine at the end of life. And that birth machine, being capable of magnifying life by a factor of 5, takes that 5-inch cube and blows it up into a 25-inch cube. So that comes out the output side of the second birth machine. Starting at the left, we have a cube of 1 unit. It transitions through birth where it gets expanded 5 times to become a cube that is now 5 units. The cube transitions through birth a second time. This time, however, it goes in as a 5-unit cube. It gets multiplied again by 5 times and comes out as a cube that is now 25 units. In the last section we looked at birth in terms of a birth machine. The idea is you pass through the birth machine, and twice. We pass through it at the beginning of life and we pass through it at the end of life. So what I was trying to demonstrate is that life takes a step up at birth and it takes another step up at the end of life. So what I've done here with this illustration is showing it in a little different format. So here on the left side here we have birth. So what we have is nothing, which is what was before birth, and we have life, which is what after birth. So the relationship between the nothing and life is exactly the same at the end of life, death, as life is to what this is going to be. In other words, this stepped up through the birth machine to become this. So now here, this goes into the birth machine, steps up to become this. So what we're going to do next is we're going to quantify this to see exactly how what that question mark will equal. So to help us define what life is, in other words, the output side of birth, I've switched to this 3-dimensional program called Cheetah 3D, which, by the way, is an excellent software available for the Mac. I highly recommend it. What you see here is a scene, and I threw down a couple of objects. We have a cylinder and a sphere, and over here is the camera. So what I want to do is I want to define the moment of birth, conception, as the moment that this camera right here turns on. So we went from nothing to the camera turning on. That is what we define as the output of birth. Now what I want to show you here is right now we're looking at this in perspective view. So what I want to do up here, I want to flip this to camera view. So now we're looking through the camera. So basically the beginning of life, that camera turns on and we're looking at the world. But what I want to take note of here is right here, this area right here. This is the camera. Now what you can see is the position here is at 0 in X, 0 in Y, 0 in Z. It's one point located in the center of the environment. And also I want to point out that down here, this is the timeline. So we're located right here at this red mark on the timeline. So what you have at the output of birth is this position within the environment that is a single point. So the takeaway here is that before birth we have nothing. Go through our birth machine, we come out, we have a position, a single point within a time-space continuum. That is what we define as birth. I want to return to this diagram here and look at the left side specifically. So what we have here is birth, conception. So on top we have before birth, on the bottom we have after birth. This way as this is expressed here is it sets up the relationship between before and after. So what you have before is nothing. The camera's off. There's nothing there. There's a blank, whatever. On bottom, the camera turns on. You have position. In other words, you have an active camera that's located within the environment. So the important thing here is that camera is at a specific location. It has an X value, Y, Z, and time. During life, we're in the center of the environment all the time. So what you have is a relationship between nothing and a single point. You have nothing, goes through a birth machine, it becomes a single point. So now we move to the right side of the equation in an attempt to answer what happens in afterlife. We look at the end of life now. So we have here, we have on top, we have before the end of life. On the bottom, we have after the end of life. And the relationship between before the end of life and after the end of life is exactly the same relationship as in birth. So in other words, you can think of the relationship between nothing and a single point equaling a single point, and what comes out the bottom is all of time and all of space. So if you look at this, the way to sum this up now, you have nothing, you have a single point coming out, you have a single point going in, you have all of time and space coming out. This is how it works out mathematically. Let's take a closer look at the equation on the lower right side where I say life becomes everything. Take a look at this drawing here. So what you have now is you have a man walking through a field, and these arrows here indicate his field of vision. So basically his camera is on and it's located right here. So let's just say now that he gets hit by a bolt of lightning or whatever. He ends his life right here. So basically this camera shuts off. Now goes through the birth machine, and basically what happens is the single point right here where his camera was goes out in all directions, out to the outer limits of his surrounding environment. That is what happens at the end of life. Additionally, he's in the present here. When this camera turns off, that timeline stops, the camera turns off, in exactly the same way, that point of time goes throughout all time. So what you have on the lower right side of that diagram at the other side of the end of life is this single point in time and space right here expanding throughout all time and space. At the end of life, at the moment of death, life undergoes a dimensional change, a change in dimension, where that single point becomes all of time and space. So basically, afterlife is only one moment long from your perspective, but from the perspective of this right here, the person going through it, that one moment in time becomes all of time, and that one moment in space becomes all of space. And that's able to take place because of memory. At the end of life, when that camera turns off, awareness goes throughout memory, which is everything you've ever experienced. So basically, you become all knowledge, you see everyone you've ever known, you become all seeing and all knowing, you become all time, and you become all space.